Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Wolkowitz. I'm a senior psychometrician with Alpine. I primarily work on the professional credentialing side. I work along with several other psychometricians on that team. Lisa is representing the IT credentialing side. So Lisa, I'll let you introduce a little bit of your role in your team.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Amanda. So this is Lisa O'Leary. I'm the Director of IT Credentialing, Senior Psychometrician, as both Quinn and Amanda indicated. I'm going to be taking more of a backseat on today's webinar. I've conducted a couple in the past, so we're going to let Amanda kind of take the lead, but I'm certainly here if there's any IT-specific kind of notes that I want to be sure to send, or if anyone has any security-related questions and how we can loop some of that information into health checks. I'm certainly here to help address any of those questions that you may have. So thanks all for joining.
Yeah, and I've told Lisa throughout this presentation, if there's ever a time where she feels like it's slightly different with IT, or if there's something to add, she will just jump in. So let's go ahead and get started. We will leave some time at the end to answer questions. So the title is Test Health Checks. Are your tests tired? You might not know what a health check is, but we will define that as we go. But here's just starting off, a quote supposedly to Albert Einstein, from Albert Einstein. Everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will spend its whole life believing that it's stupid. So basically what we're getting at is if you aren't testing what you're supposed to test.
Amanda, excuse me. It seems that your screen might be frozen. Some of the participants are mentioning that they can't see the advancement. Is anybody having trouble seeing the screen? Is it advancing properly? Looks like it's being resolved. Okay, go ahead, Amanda. I apologize for the interruption.
Okay. Okay, so we want to make sure that your exam is targeting the correct candidates and that it's up to date on the current topics, that it doesn't get out of date. So the purpose of today is to review ways that you can check that. Check that your exams are not tired, that they're not out of date, but also that they are continually addressing their purpose and staying current with the times. So the purpose and ability, it's very important when you're thinking about your test. So a test needs to address both the purpose of the test, extremely important, measure the intended construct, and the score should lead to a valid interpretation of an examinee's ability in the given construct. Again, that interpretation, that the way people use the score is extremely important and a huge part of validity. So thinking about that first part, the intended construct, if you think about the construct of your test, what you want are all the items on your test to be focused on the right content and be right on target, exactly what the purpose of the test is. What can happen over time? This might happen, say, in a medical exam where the field changes, new medicines are introduced, yet if the exam doesn't keep up with it, what you're going to see is you still have that purpose of the test, but your items are no longer following that construct. Alternatively, you could have your construct needed to get updated, but you're not updating your items. Either way, you get a misalignment. What you want to have is that alignment to stay with the times. You want to keep your test construct up to date, and you want to keep your items focused on that right construct. In addition to the items, you also have your candidate population. You want to make sure that your test is focused on the intended target of your exam. Right now, that green line there represents a cut score. I realize there's other exams, perhaps in education, where you have multiple cut scores. But just for the sake of an example, say you have one cut score, and you want your exam to really focus on the target and be able to separate out the minimally qualified, so those that can and those that can't. If your test has drifted in performance, if you aren't attacking the correct candidates, what can happen is that your items, again, in your test construct are no longer aligned and your cut score gets off. In this example here, you have your cut score way too low and not enough people are passing it. I'm sorry, too many people are passing it. Here you have a very high pass rate, or the opposite can happen and you have a very high cut score and you have very few people passing it. Again, what you want to do to make sure that your test stays current is to keep the test construct and the items focusing on the purpose and staying up to date, and having your candidates and the test be aligned so that it's still focusing on the right people and the right content. So the question to you is, do your tests currently do that? Are your tests currently up to date? Are you keeping up to date with those changes? One of the ways to do that is what we're going to be talking about today. Just in general, just as a reminder, a good test has to be reliable and it has to be fair. And together, those all contribute to the validity of the test. The validity that accurately, appropriately measures what is relevant. Again, as we mentioned before, the interpretation of the score is extremely important. So for every use of that test score, you have to make sure that there's a valid interpretation of it. Along the way, there's many different pieces of the validity, and this is what we call at Alpine the validity wheel. Every part of your test development cycle contributes to validity, starting with the very beginning at the 12 o'clock part of this diagram of designing the purpose of your program. Everything has to center on the purpose, but that also starts the foundation of the validity. I'm not going to go into all these different pieces, but this should look similar to the process that you take in your own program, where you go from designing a test all the way to perhaps doing a job analysis and to developing the blueprint and the content. And then I have this red, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Pre-testing, creating your forms, doing a standard setting, and maintaining the test. All parts of these processes contribute to the validity of an exam. Now, the two parts that I have in red are the ones that we're going to talk about today. That's where what Alpine calls a health check come into play. And a health check is a way for you to check on how your exam is doing. It's to check on the performance of your exam. Again, that would happen during an operational beta. And then also, once you have your test live, just doing a constant, regular check on how well your test is doing. And we're going to look at some examples today to help you understand exactly what we're talking about. But for that first box, for an exam release cycle, the typical cycle that you might see, although there could be some variations, is you start with a beta item selection. This would be where you administer a beta exam, operational beta, and you want to gather some initial item statistics, exam level statistics, and see how is everything doing. Once you've gathered that and you've given it out to some candidates, you bring it back in, and this is what we call a health check, is we would do an initial health check where we analyze the data after that beta exam and start to review the item and form level statistics. And at this point, there might be some back and forth with the client and with subject matter experts to say these items have come up flagged. Let's talk about it. Let's see what's going on. And in some cases, what's going to happen after your operational beta and after you've done an analysis is you're going to make some scored and unscored decisions. So if you have unscored items on your test, you have that flexibility. So typically what happens if you do have those unscored items is you have your operational beta, and after an initial health check, you'll see that some items aren't performing as well as they could, but some unscored items are. So you can make those swaps. At that point, you can finalize the form, conduct your standard setting, and then maintain the health checks. In other words, after you've administered the form, you're going to want to do another health check to see, is the exam performing as intended? Is it hitting the right people? Are your items, something else you can check during the review, are your items still performing as expected? Is everything meeting the purpose of the test and focusing on the right people? Just for routine maintenance, these health checks you want to do at certain volumes or administration periods. And we will talk about that a little bit more later. So I've said the word health check. Let me just give a definition for you. Well, when I say health check, I mean it's a way to check on the overall health of the exam. Just like we would go to a doctor to get a checkup, your exams can get a checkup as well. It's intended to answer the question, is your exam performing as expected? Are there issues that need to be addressed? Do you see some items that are drifting in performance? That could be an indication that those items are getting tired. They aren't relevant to the exam anymore or the content. They need to be adjusted. Or maybe your candidate population is starting to drift with the changes in the curriculum. And that's also starting to see an effect, and you're seeing that in your health checks. So is something going on that's not expected? And so, if so, let's check it out. So the types of analyses that you might include in a health check would be form level analyses, item level analyses, option, perhaps some high level security analyses. And I'm going to give you an example later on in this presentation of what these could look like. So when would you conduct a health check? It can vary, and it also dependent on your program, on your volume, your target audience. You want to make sure you have representativeness in your sample. If you conduct a health check early on after you've released an exam, but it all comes from the same population of candidates, perhaps all from the same location or the same demographic, you might not have a good representative enough sample to have the data give you what you want it to know. It might be somewhat biased. So you want to make sure that you have an appropriate volume, appropriate representativeness, it's getting the target audience, everything you see on the screen here. Now, how often do you do it? If you have a low volume exam, meaning perhaps less than 100 candidates per year, you probably want to do it annually. The only exception is once you release that exam, and this goes for any exam, as soon as you release a new exam, perhaps after a standard setting, you want to check on how that exam is doing as soon as possible. I know of cases where people have waited, or programs have waited a year to check on the health of their exam, and they find out a year later that they had a problem with an item. You don't want to be in that situation. So the sooner that you can just do a quick check, the better. And then after that, doing some maintenance. So here's some general guidelines, low volume, like less than 100, maybe annually. As the volume starts to go up, you could go to biannually, high volume, perhaps quarterly, or if it's really high volume, you might want to do it monthly. And the reason we're recommending doing it more often with a higher volume is largely because of security. You might realize that once you release an exam, especially if it's a high volume exam, the chances of it getting compromised goes up. So by doing health checks on a regular basis, you can start to see if anything is starting to get compromised, if your whole exam is starting to get compromised, or perhaps just some items are starting to get compromised. It also allows you to track how your exam is doing over time.
Amanda, I'm just going to jump in real quick. This is Lisa.
Sure.
Following on to what Amanda said about if there is, if you're very high volume, those monthly health checks, or perhaps every 6 weeks, could help you identify a problem. Additionally, it can also help with detection and enforcement of security policies that you may have in place, especially if you're able to run those health checks more in real time against the data. So there's multiple benefits, not only in terms of kind of detection, but also in terms of enforcement of policies. And then coupled with that, Alpine would recommend a continual seeding of unscored items so that you're constantly collecting data on additional pilot items as you're administering those live forms. And the health checks are logical points in time for you to be able to collect the statistics on those unscored items, as Amanda indicated earlier, and then make some decisions about what items that you want to use going forward. One main benefit of being able to make those decisions about turning unscored items into scored items is that you're therefore able to do a forms reassembly following your health check, in which case you can prioritize the use of the well-performing unscored items and hopefully stave off security issues until the next go-round for your health check. In other words, you can keep the content hopefully as uncompromised as possible, particularly in the IT environment where we know some level of item compromise is a given reality rather than an unfortunate circumstance. So just wanted to couple that on, that these health checks can be coupled with the forms reassemblies, which are very beneficial in terms of rapid republication and helping to stave off security issues as much as possible.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. Okay, well, why would you conduct one? Lisa just gave you several reasons of why you might conduct a health check, and we'll list a few more reasons here. Again, as we've been stating, evaluating statistical data regarding your form and item level performance during the operational administration. Are your items doing exactly as intended? Are they drifting in performance? Do you have some that are being compromised? And same not only with the item level, but you can also look at your candidates. If the more often that you are checking your data and doing health checks, you can also look to see, are there some candidates that are performing extremely well in a very short amount of time? So that's something else that you could look at. It also provides evidence that, especially if your program is accredited, to have that you're getting to the purpose of your exam, and you can see that in some of the statistics that you run. You have good statistics for your exams. You have the appropriateness of your standard setting results you can have evidence of that. Again, depending on your health checks, as Lisa mentioned, there's some security issues that might turn up. So a lot of the things that are mentioned on this slide you can get from looking at a health check. So lots of reasons why to conduct them. Them more often, you might see a spike in a pass rate over a certain administration period. That might be beneficial to you. And again, we talked about the performance, making sure they're performing as expected and they haven't drifted. We talked about exposure as well. So again, all of this provides that validity evidence that you need to help support the interpretation of your exam scores, that they remain appropriate over time and that they don't get misaligned. Also, for those of you that are accredited, and even if you're not accredited, the health checks again provide that evidence that you need. It's best practices, it's mentioned health checks, not the word health check, but the information you get from health checks are provided in the standards, the AERA, APA, and CME standards. It's mentioned in the NCCA standards, specifically 19 and 20, although it's probably referenced in other ones. ANSI standards, section 9 for the certification process requirements. So the health checks provide evidence that can be used as documentation in those applications for accreditation and for the routine documentation needed to maintain the accreditation. And then going through these last few slides a little bit quicker so we have time for some questions. Once you've run a health check, then what do? Well, again, just make sure you have a policy in place. The documentation is so important. Have a policy that describes what you're going to do with the flagged item. Follow that policy. What are you going to do with a possible security breach? Follow that policy. Having a policy is an example of documentation, so make sure you have that. After you do a health check, what's next? Well, if you think back to that validity wheel, if it's maintenance, you can reassemble new forms. You can equate new forms, balance them, scale them, maximize the content relevancy, minimize your item exposure, perhaps by minimizing your overlap, retiring items that are known to have performance issues. So basically, after your health check, you can go on to build new forms. Or if it's your first initial health check, then you go on to that final assembly and into a standard setting. Again, the whole point of a health check is to make sure that your exam is staying focused on what it's supposed to stay focused on. Is it up to date? Is it still aligned with the exam purpose? You might find that some of your items that aren't performing well, it's because they're no longer aligned to what's going on out in the industry. So be flexible to be able to make some domain and content shifts as needed based on what your statistics are telling you. And it's to the extent that the changes will drive necessary exam maintenance activities, meaning as you make changes, you have to be flexible as well to maintain the exam with whether it's a health check or perhaps you have to do another job analysis. Whatever the indication is of what's going on with your exam, if things are getting tired, how tired are they? Does it require just some new items or does it require perhaps a new job analysis? So things to think about.